Hello and welcome back to another update on the Russo-Ukrainian war, where we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. In this one, the Russians have started a massive offensive operation in the Bakhmut direction, where they've managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses here to the north of Klishivka and occupied half of the fortified area to the northwest of Klishivka in the hills. So this area here is on the high ground, and as you can see from these satellite images, there's heavy fortifications and trenches all throughout the area. So the Russian forces managed to push through the northwestern parts of Klishivka and managed to occupy half of it, while pushing the Ukrainians out of the other half, leaving it as a gray zone. So now there is heavy fighting taking place over the fortifications. If the Russians are able to hold on to it and continue capturing the rest of it, then the Ukrainian positions all throughout the southern parts, the southern flank of Bakhmut, will be vulnerable. This whole area could be at risk of encirclement, as Russian forces would be able to push westwards, specifically to capture this fortification right here, but also just to gain control over the area up to the canal path. With that, they would be able to launch a pincer maneuver from Andrivka and Klishivka together to cut off the Ukrainian forces here in the Klishivka area, as well as south of Andrivka. So this is a huge risk for the Ukrainian forces to be forced to either launch a counterattack to regain the fortifications to the northwest of Klishivka, or they'll end up having to fight out of an encirclement if they do not retreat out of their currently held positions. And with this, Russian forces would negate the whole advancements of the Ukrainian forces all throughout this 6-month-long counteroffensive. And we see at the same time the Russian forces managed to advance here to the northwest of Bakhmut in the direction of Ryhorivka and Bogdanivka, where they've managed to take control over the parts of this forest line here that goes between the two, cutting off the road between the two villages. And these advancements are only because of the weather. The weather has made this possible. If the ground was not frozen, then the Russian forces would not be able to launch armored assaults, and there's no way they have captured this without launching an armored assault. So this is what has happened. The Ukrainian forces are now at the brink of collapse in the flanks of Ukraine, as the Russian forces have managed to cut off an important road between Bogdanivka and Ryhorivka, as well as capture half of the fortifications north of Klishivka. If the Russian forces capture the whole fortification, then the Ukrainian lines to the south of Bakhmut would definitely collapse. That is the significant nature of this fortification and the risks the Ukrainian forces are running by not launching a counterattack here as soon as possible, because that is what they need to do. They can give up all of the gains they have made here in the south if they just manage to recapture these fortifications. That is the significance of it. However, even with all of this, it would still not cut out as a massive offensive. So we also see fighting taking place to the northeast of Vesele. And the reason I call it a massive offensive is because we're seeing that they are putting more efforts into attacking than they have ever done in the direction of Bakhmut, with the Russian forces combined with former Wagner soldiers now stormed in the southern and northern flanks of Bakhmut, as well as in the direction of Siversk by the Vesele direction. And this is significant because Vesele is first of all isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian held villages in the area, but capturing Vesele would allow the Russian forces to then push on to Rostolivka and Vasyukivka here to the west of the Vesele direction. And with these villages, they will be able to start offensive operations here to the north of Selesnyansk and start pushing in the direction of the canal here to the north as well. So we're seeing a three-pronged attack of the Russian forces towards the canal by launching attacks in the direction of Klishivka, Ryhorivka/Bogdanivka, and finally to the north of Vesele in the direction of Siversk. All of these together is a clear indication that the Russian forces are looking to launch an attack that will allow them to hold the canal line here west of Bakhmut and have that as the front line. And this is a significant development because it goes all the way down to the Seversky Donetsk River, and the Ukrainian forces have a huge contingent of troops here by the Siversk direction, either 10 to 20,000 soldiers. All of these would be in a situation where, first of all, these are elite Ukrainian soldiers who have been able to hold the line against Russian forces since the Russian forces first captured Bilorivka a year ago. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are actually in a situation where the Ukrainian forces here outmatch them. The Ukrainian soldiers by Siversk outmatched the Russian soldiers. This is why it's significant that they launched this offensive, because if they are able to cut off the Ukrainian forces in this direction, then they don't have to fight them. They'll be able to go around them. And that is, in the end, the essence of warfare. If you cannot fight, go around. Finally, there's been some Ukrainian advances here in the north in direction of Ivanivka and Yahidne, with the Ukrainian forces managing to advance slightly and capturing parts of this forest line here in between the two villages, as well as the road here. So with this, the Ukrainian forces may be looking to put some pressure on the Russian forces after the offensive operations in the direction of Kislivka here and Kotlярivka here to the south of Ivanivka, which shows that the Ukrainian forces are still able to launch offensive operations here in the Kupiansk direction, which shows that they have enough forces to deal with the situation currently. However, we see in the Bakhmut direction that it is clearly in the Russian favor, and that is most likely due to the fatigue of the launching the offensive after 6 months, and now the Russian forces, having built up and rotated their soldiers, are able to launch some counter-offensive if you look at Western media headlines. But in reality, it can only be one of two things, either an offensive or a counter-offensive. Just to explain the terminology shortly, an offensive is when the front line has been stable and there's been no operations and someone launches an offensive. That is like the Zaporizhia front, where the Ukrainians launched an offensive. There's been no offensive operations in this direction for months. Then the Ukrainians started an offensive. A counter-offensive is when someone has launched an offensive and then you counterattack, you respond to that offensive. So the Russian forces launched an offensive, captured Bakhmut. The Ukrainian forces launched a counter-offensive on the flanks, trying to capture and managed to capture Klishivka and Andrivka. And then this is yet again a counter-offensive, as the Russian forces are responding to a Ukrainian counter-offensive. Then it is still a counter-offensive. There's no reason to mention counter twice. And then finally, considering I mention a collapse, what do I mean by that? Well, as you can see, this section of the front line is tiny compared to the whole country. So even if the Ukrainian defenses collapse by Bakhmut, it doesn't mean that it is going to end the war. It means simply that the Russian forces will be able to make significant advances that are unlike what they've been doing so far. These are all small advances. We see these advancements, at most they are a couple of square kilometers. We, however, see that they have increased. And these are areas where there's heavily fortifications. There's a lot of Ukrainian troops dealing with them. So if they manage to capture these fortifications, then advances that are double or triple these sizes will appear. And as such, it would be a collapse. That is why I use the word collapse, because that is when the fortifications have been taken. The rest that is missing is open fields with less fortifications. And that is when the Russian forces can overrun Ukrainian forces, possibly encircling them, capturing them, and so on. Similar to the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk direction last year in the summer, where the Russian forces managed to collapse the Ukrainian defenses in the area, forcing them to retreat out of the village and leaving Lysychansk as fallen within a week after Severodonetsk, which Severodonetsk itself took many months. So that is the sort of situation I'm talking about. However, it doesn't seem there will be a complete collapse of the front line. It will simply be a local collapse by Klishivka and Bohdanivka/Hryhorivka, where they will try to reach the front line by the canal. And I believe this will raise some questions for you, the viewers. Then what is a collapse of the Ukrainian front? What is the collapse that would cause Ukraine to end this war, to surrender, to retreat, to end the war, to lose the war? Well, there are many aspects to that. But first of all, the most obvious one is if Western support stops and the Ukrainian forces run out of ammunition. However, this is not a one day they have, one day they don't. It is where they are at a point where they don't have much, so they start to ration it. And because they ration it, they do not have the fire capability to deal with the Russian forces, who do not really ration it that much. They have a much higher expenditure compared to Ukraine because of their own production. Therefore, in a scenario where the balance right now is somewhere around 10,000 a day for the Russians and 5,000 a day for the Ukrainians. What if this ends up being 1,000 a day for the Ukrainians and 15,000 a day for the Russians? I say 10,000 a day because that is about what they produce. So they can at some point increase more than what they are using, of what they're producing. That is because they are importing from North Korea, for example. If they start importing from China, they've imported from Iran. So there's many possibilities, but essentially that will make it a 2-to-1 compared to a 15-to-1. And that is when we can see a collapse of the front line. That is the obvious one. Then there's also the possibility of the Ukrainians simply losing on the battlefield. If the Ukrainian forces get overrun by the front line, then they can have huge amounts of soldiers, of equipment and so on being encircled. And at that point, they do not have the necessary reserves to continue dealing with the Russian forces, and they'll simply overrun the Ukrainian defenders. So there's many options. That is what the Ukrainians were looking to do in the southern front, where they were looking to outrun and cut off the Russian forces in the Kherson and Crimea directions by cutting off the land bridge and then destroying the bridge here by the Kerch Bridge. So at that point, everything here to the west of Crimea and Kherson region would be isolated and encircled from the rest of Russia. Therefore, they would look to capture a lot of units and capture a lot of units. However, this failed. They just managed to make a bulge, and that is when the Russian forces started attacking here in the Bakhmut direction. However, as long as they continue fighting in the Donbass region, they'll never be able to do a major offensive overrun, cutting off Ukrainian forces, because they would need to do a much larger operations like attacking Dnipro or capturing Kharkiv here in the north. Doing this at the same time, something like that, to cut off all of the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass region and in the Kharkiv and Dnipro-Zaporizhzhia regions. This sort of major operation is required for them to overrun Ukrainian forces. Therefore, it is not going to happen unless they launch a massive operation like this and they actually succeed. Similar to at the very start of the war, the Russian forces managed to capture Kherson and they managed to capture Mariupol. If they did this quickly and not so slow, then they could have cut off a massive amount of forces here in the north. But in the end, they surrounded Mariupol fairly quickly. Therefore, 10,000 Ukrainian forces were stuck in the city, and therefore the Ukrainian forces had huge losses at the start of the war due to the sheer amounts being captured and overrun by the Russian forces due to their initial push. So this is the significance of massive operations. Why would you do them if you know that you're going to take heavy losses? Because in the end, if you succeed, you're able to cut off tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of troops at the front line, similar to the Second World War, where there were massive encirclements in Ukraine of German forces over the Soviet forces, where at some points, like the Battle of Kiev, they encircled up to 800,000 soldiers in one battle. That is the significance of quick fighting, blitzkrieg, whatever you want to call it. And in the end, that is not something we have seen this war. We have just seen Battle of Attrition, which is soldiers at the front line shooting at each other, hoping that they kill more than they die. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.